Well, hello, and welcome. It really is lovely to be back with you once again today. For those of you that don't know, my name is Lord Hardthrasher, 3rd Earl of Lower Slaughter, and proud founder of Toff Confused Weekly. This channel covers a number of things, mostly my wafflings about history, a lot of which has been decidedly modern up to this point. We haven't, for example, dived back into the Dark Ages, nor looked at, say, the Napoleonic Wars, nor hundreds of other topics that aren't modern geopolitics, planes, or World War II. And those things most assuredly are coming, so fair warning to those of you that like their history a bit more recent. However, if that is you, good news today, because we're going to be covering the history of Blackburn Aircraft and their only decent plane, the Buccaneer. Before we get into it, a few quick parish notices. Firstly, I swear quite a bit, and you may want to check who can hear what I'm saying before you mortally offend your mother-in-law. Whilst apparently there are a lot of people out there that are quite happy for me to swear, one or two individuals who would merrily watch people getting slaughtered on television in black and white get very offended by the word it upsets them, so just so you know. Secondly, I have a Patreon. If you'd like to join, I'll do a sexy little dance for you. Okay, actually, look, I'm not going to do a sexy little dance for you. What I will do, though, is I will give you access to my super secret Discord, wherein you will find the answers to life, the universe, and everything. Well, if not that, maybe at least the answer to the question, what if I give Lord Hardthrasher $6 a month, so he can continue his increasingly desperate attempt to improve his sound quality. By the way, today I'm recording on a Cherry UM9 mic. It lights up and everything. It's very cool. They sent me one. It's wicked. I can't operate it at all. So basically, help me help you. Thank you. Lastly, you'll be pleased to know that Ukrainian Anna has bought a whole bunch of ear protection and protection helmet mounts for the money that we raised off the last video, which is really exciting. She says a huge thank you to all the nerds that donated, and also she says that I must never try to say her last name again when she has a mouthful of water, because it made her laugh too hard and it came out of her nose. Very kind, I'm sure. Right, those notices completed, onward and indeed backwards to the Blackburn Aircraft Company at the dawn of flight. It is a sad truth that some of us simply cannot draw a straight line, nor make things from wood, nor build things out of metal. On occasion, her ladyship has asked me to make things for her, presumably because she forgot how badly it went last time. Last weekend, as an example, she asked me, in what I can only assume was a fit of optimism or perimenopausal panic, to go and make her some raised flower beds. This involved putting large bits of wood together and filling them with soil. Being a sensible husband, I simply replied, yes, of course, my little cave bear of delight, and proceeded to the shed. After several hours and a lot of sawing, I had assembled something that had 5 corners, was 2 inches high. Eventually, I gave up and took to adding some screws to Jenkins's much neater construction. It was just about strong enough to hold together, so we declared victory and moved on. I'm told by Jenkins that the tortured metalwork I left inside is safely hidden from view by enough earth to bury a body. Given his familiarity with that particular unit of measurement, I made no further inquiries. The thing is, I have always had this problem, despite carefully measuring everything, 5 times, drawing lines very carefully, using laser levels, looking out on YouTube, consulting friends and so forth. It always seems to go horrifically badly for me. Never in my life have I ever been able to put anything together that is straight or level or square or cut to the right length, much less made anything which is aesthetically pleasing. But I am very enthusiastic. Like a keen but dim puppy, I get all excited about what I could build, and each and every time my total lack of skill prevents me from fulfilling my dreams. And in this regard, I consider myself heir to a fine tradition of innovative, interesting, and ultimately awful design started by Robert Blackburn in 1908. Robert was an engineer from Leeds in Yorkshire. For those who are overseas listeners, I should probably explain. Yorkshire is unique, often known as the People's Republic of Yorkshire, or potentially the Democratic People's Republic of Yorkshire, a place that built itself up in the late 1700s and early 1800s to become one of the workshops of the world. Its primary industry was mining. This is not a land of florists and telephone operators. This is a place where fucking great engineering happens. The county is wet, cold, windswept, and beautiful all at the same time. If you work down a mine, straight talking and heavy engineering go hand in hand with a kind of conservative form of creativity. If you screw it up, people die, so things are bolted not once or twice, but 3 times, and mealy-mouthed politeness is shunned as a southern nonsense. A spade is a spade, and a whippet is a whippet. Robert's approach to aircraft manufacturing embodied the best and indeed the worst of his county, and it might kindly be described as industrial. His first plane demonstrated his general approach. The imaginatively named Blackburn Heavy monoplane had a number of innovations, including a three-dimensional control column, movable tailplane, and an air-cooled 35-horsepower engine. Sadly, it also included vast amounts of steel and extra weights for balance, so it couldn't do stuff like, fly very far, much less turn. We should not be too unfair to Robert. We are talking 1909 here, and basically all planes crashed all the time. Powered flight itself was a matter of just a few years old. This was the golden age of lunatics in sheds, with all the aesthetic simplicity of a picture made by a drunken spider dropped in ink. Things developed fast for the putative industry as a whole, and by the outbreak of World War I, Blackburn was really hitting his stride. Water and flying are not necessarily great bedfellows, as can be seen by the relative paucity of seaplanes flying today, although I am excited to note that the US has just announced that they're building the Catalina 2. That's a beautiful aircraft. Robert wouldn't have made a Catalina, and those graceful lines were well beyond him. No, he made bonkers things like the twin Blackburn TB. It was really something quite special. Two planes bolted together with a big set of wings. It showed many of the design characteristics which would set Blackburn Aircraft apart for the next 50 years, in that it was slow, impossible to handle, very ugly, and caught fire every time it took off. The problem was it had rotary engines which created pools of petrol which would then sit on the skids, and during priming they would ignite as the engines did. A minor drawback, I'm sure you'll agree, and really what is a co-pilot even for if not there to put fires out on your wooden and canvas seaplane? Envisioned as a Zeppelin hunter, it really had only one primary drawback, in that it couldn't really hunt Zeppelins. It was both slower and it couldn't fly as high. BAE Systems, who now own Blackburn, list the TB as a seaplane trainer, and the only thing pilots would have been trained to do by the TB was to get out as fast as possible. However, Blackburn Aircraft used the experience to develop into new heights. See, in these early days of flying, the Royal Navy was a serious player in aeronautical development, viewing the ability to enforce a blockade by air as a natural adjunct to being able to enforce a blockade by sea. Indeed, the first proper air raid was conducted by the Royal Navy on the Zeppelin sheds in Denmark in Christmas 1914. Of course, as things developed over time, the Royal Navy realised that their massive investment in fuck-off great big battleships was put into question by things like carriers, so they began to try and throttle off funding and development of seaborne air power, but that's probably a story for a bit later on. Back in 1915, Blackburn, encouraged by the Royal Navy, developed a thing called the AD Scout, which is basically a bathtub, 3 wings, a 40mm recoilless rifle, and a great deal of hope. And by 1916, everybody had realised that this was, to use the technical term, a piece of shit. Blackburn went back to the TB as a result, and he built it into something which became known as the Kangaroo. And eventually, toward the end of 1918, finally it did something useful, and it bombed UC-70. It didn't sink it, but fair play, that wasn't an easy job, and it was able to radio a nearby destroyer, and the Royal Navy then came and finished the job. So there was a flash of competence there after a mere 4 years of war. If one was being uncharitable, one could claim with some justification that Robert had made 2 planes in 4 years of war, none of which was really any much cop. These basic factors, slightly shite engineering, planes so ugly they angered God, and the occasional flash of innovation and brilliance, would continue to dominate Blackburn's designs for the next 50-odd years. Interwar they produced the Blackburn Baffin, the Ripon, the Shark, all of which were so crap that the first chance the Royal Navy got, they swapped them out for the Fairy Swordfish, itself a ridiculously underpowered and obsolete aircraft, allegedly a plane so slow that when it attacked the Bismarck, the AA guns on board couldn't keep up with it, or so the legend goes. Undeterred by the string of mediocrity that was Blackburn up to that point, the designers and engineers went back to go for something totally radical in 1937, to wit an all-metal plane. Well done, lads. Fuck me, better late than never, I suppose. As was traditional by now, the Royal Navy was trying to get one of its aircraft to do 2 completely different jobs simultaneously, and Blackburn kept up its end of the traditions by delivering something that was massively underpowered and capable of neither role, being recognised as obsolete as soon as it was built. And thus was born the infamous Skua. Lacking any serious manoeuvrability and armed with just 4 .303 machine guns where all other RAF fighters at the time had 8, this was a pretty shit fighter, although it did manage to shoot down a number of bombers and transport planes in the Norway campaign. When in dive bomb mode, it had a habit of, as Fleet Air Arm Wags put it, being very similar to the bird it takes its name from, in that it likes to fold its wings and dive into the sea. Not content with the Skua, Blackburn essentially decided that it was too light and too fast, and so it developed the Blackburn Rock, which was capable of flying at just 223 miles an hour at full chat in 1938. For context, the Japanese era could do 100 miles an hour faster than that and flew 6 months later. Stealing the very worst design features from across the world, they decided then that they needed to add the complicated electrical turret off the Boulton-Paul Defiant, and they also decided to try and sling some bombs under the wings because, actually, to be honest, I've got no idea why they tried that. The Rock was, despite having been absolutely slated by anyone unfortunate enough to fly one, forced into production just as World War II broke out, thereby ensuring that Blackburn held the unblemished record of producing rubbish designs at just the wrong moment. It scored a massive 1 kill in the entire war before being hurried off stage left and used to tug targets. Blackburn then got embroiled in further attempts to create a true all-round aircraft for the Royal Navy, and it began work on the infamous Firebrand. Now, if you know your aircraft, you will probably be gently weeping at this point. If you don't, well, let's sum up the Firebrand like this. One test pilot was supposed to have said, "The Firebrand is hard to get into. It should be made impossible." Plagued by technical difficulties, engine changes, scope changes, and endless delays, despite flying in 1942, it wasn't actually in production until the end of 1945, and it served for just 6 years with the Royal Navy, seeing very limited service in Korea. What came out of this ridiculous period was actually bloody good. Maybe the first time that Blackburn had ever made something that the crews didn't roll their eyes at, but it meant that Blackburn had missed World War II almost entirely, in exactly the same way that they'd missed World War I almost entirely. By 1948, the Royal Navy really had had enough, and Blackburn had no naval aircraft in production. Its reputation had been essentially trashed. But of course, this is Blackburn, so it wasn't going to let a little thing like the advent of jet engines or having no money bother it. No siree. Where there's aviation, there's cash, or something. So in 1950, Blackburn took on the might of Lockheed and produced Hull's answer to the mighty Hercules, the Blackburn Beverley. Like the Hercules, it was a 4-engine transport aircraft. Like the Hercules, it could fly. But unlike the Hercules, it was made for tuppence, had a rubbish load capacity, was hard to service, and looked like a slapped arse. They made 49 of these bastards, and then they gave up. And in 1955, they began work on one final project to try and save the company. And that project was the Blackburn Buccaneer. As has probably become apparent by now, if you wanted a video about a plane that was the fastest at something, or could fly the highest at something, or carry the most bombs or something, then you are in entirely the wrong place. Come to that, if you were in the Royal Navy and you wanted any of those things, you could basically go anywhere except for Blackburn. Actually, in fairness, they had tried. I've been rude about Blackburn throughout this, but let's not forget that it takes two to tango. The Admiralty had, for example, ordered the de Havilland Sea Vixen in 1951, which was actually wound up being delayed until 1959, by which point it was ridiculously obsolete against something like, say, the MiG-21. Not that the Vixen needed an opponent to wind up in the sea. Something like 38% of all Vixens fell out of the sky, killing most of the aircrew in the process. Terrifyingly, that was actually slightly better than the nuclear-capable Supermarine Scimitar, which first flew in 1956, and over the following 12 years killed about 50% of its crew. I make this point only to say that between some British manufacturers and the Admiralty, the first half of the 20th century, it was very hard to know whether they wanted to kill the enemy or their own crews more. There is a reason that Fleet Air Arm pilots were considered some of the best in the world. If they weren't, they were dead. Given this tendency towards utter disaster, it's hardly surprising that when in 1955 Blackburn put forward an incredibly mediocre airframe that looked like it might be reliable but not totally shit, the Royal Navy was frankly floored by this giant step forward. Known as the Blackburn Advanced Naval Bomber, and inevitably being nicknamed the Banana Bomber as a result, it was designed to fly below the height of the Severo-class cruiser's hull, that's roughly 50 feet, and thus under the radar search plane. It was supposed to be able to cruise at about 500 knots or better, be nuclear capable, and have a range of not less than 1,000 miles, carrying 12,000 pounds of bombs. Impressive statistics, but not the best of anything in particular, and thus was born, into mediocrity, the Blackburn Buccaneer, the last production that Brough would ever make, and comfortably its best. The The Buck was a big old beast because it needed to fly low and fast. It was something like 60 foot long and 44 feet wide. Whilst it didn't break new ground in any one area, it proved to be an astoundingly capable platform from its introduction in 1962 to its retirement by the RAF in the 1990s. Despite its size, the Buck is a surprisingly good-looking airframe. It's not exactly, how can I put this, it's not the sort of thing that little boys put on posters on their bedroom wall exactly, but it's fine, and I like how it's rounded and everything, and it has a certain dolphin-like quality, but this is no F4 Phantom. This being Blackburn, they initially made it too big to fit on the aircraft carriers because it was Blackburn, so they decided to cheat a bit. On the back, they gave it this dividing air brake device, which looks a bit weird and ungainly, but when you're up close to one, it kind of works. And then at the front, they gave it this foldaway nose cone, reducing the total length by about 9 feet, which allowed it to be stored on HMS Ark Royal and HMS Victorious. To fit on the hangar decks, they had to make sure that they gave it a slightly lower tail assembly than was ideal, and that made it not a lot of fun to fly at less than 300 knots, adding to the dramas in the landing pattern that we will talk about in a moment. All of this meant that they were actually too big to fly out of the manufacturing plant at Brough, having instead to load them on lorries and drive them in and out of the Yorkshire Dales, something that they did for the entire 30 years of the plane's existence, including for repair. I imagine the conversation amongst the engineers went something like this. "Oh lad, we've built a beauty here, we should fly them in and out of the factory whenever they need servicing and such." "What lad, and deprive these fine creatures of close-up view of God's own county? I think not lad, we'll send them here on trucks, aye." "What if they hit branches or telephone poles or the Red Lion?" "Never fear lad, it's not like bits of them aren't going to fall off wherever. They'll be bringing them on the trucks right back and forth all the time for repair like. We'll be coining in it for years lad." "Oh, grand, aye, grand." Typical of all Blackburn aircraft, they managed to sneak on board a bunch of very clever innovations that sort of worked. For one thing, they eschewed a straight and level bombing approach, but instead created a sort of mad reverse dive bomb approach involving tossing the bomb, which required all manner of clocks and computers that, they kind of did the job, I guess, but it just looks a bit bonkers. More interestingly, they had a thing called blown surfaces or border control, basically taking hot exhaust gases off the engines and blowing them along the wings and the tail to provide lift. This fairly kicked the aircraft into the air and allowed nice short landings, but it made the whole thing incredibly complex. You've got to remember that this is 1958. There are no computers on board. So the sudden reduction in engine power meant that you had to be very clever about your maths and your approach speeds. The percentage by which it dropped out the engine was a nice round 8.67%. I'm sure you can agree that's a really easy number to compute when you're trying to do 15 other things at once. Why they didn't just drop it by 10% or to 8% or even Christ to 8.5%, I don't know. Listening to pilots discuss these problems, they inevitably say something like, "It could get a bit busy coming into land," or "the workload was very high in the circuit." This is pilot for, "fuck me, it's going to kill someone." And trying to land on a carrier is not exactly a simple operation in the first place. I mean, for one thing, unlike landing on an airfield, it has a nasty habit of moving up and down and left and right, and mostly, hopefully, probably forwards. Also, even a big Royal Navy aircraft carrier like, say, the Ark Royal was actually teeny tiny. It was only 800 foot long and about 112 foot wide at its widest point. That's 240 metres by about 35 metres in modern English. Put it a different way, the main RAF Buccaneer base at Lossiemouth had a runway which was 10 times longer and 14 times wider. Being busy in the landing circuit was far from ideal, and it did wind up killing novice pilots. Demonstrating adherence to Blackburn's strict in-house engineering rules, the Blackburn Mark I was, of course, massively underpowered. Using a single-spool de Havilland Gyron Junior engine, which according to one test pilot meant that it could only take off due to the curvature of the Earth. Better yet, it would stall, it would spit, it would flame out, all without warning, and sometimes it would just try and flip the aircraft over. These exciting handling characteristics were combined with a total lack of dual control versions, meaning it followed a proud tradition of Blackburn aircraft doing their level best to kill off young pilots. This time, though, and uniquely for Blackburn, they actually did something about it. Not the dual control thing, that was considered altogether too unmanly for both Blackburn and the Royal Navy, but they did fix the engine and they fitted the dual-spool Rolls-Royce Spray, a superb engine that would wind up going in the Phantoms, only with the Phantoms they put a reheat function on it. Although it's not without its quirks, the dual-spool meant putting power on required a pilot to wait several seconds before moving the throttle and anything happening, which at 0 feet was somewhat alarming, if not fatal. The Sprays were a massive improvement over the Gyrons. They gave fantastic economy and a very long range, very high lift, and they pushed the Bucc to within a gnat's testicle of Mach 1 at 0 feet. Moreover, they were reliable, easy to service, and if things did fail, they were powerful enough to fly the plane on just one engine without really compromising the handling too badly. In fact, it was said that if you pushed them just a tiny bit harder, they would take the Bucc over the sound barrier, but the boys from Bruff made it quite clear that if you did that, the tailplane would fall off. Innovations like border control and having a decent engine weren't the only places in which Blackburn engineers had had a rush of blood to the pipe. The Mark II also featured a rather terrifying analogue hands-off carrier launch system which required pilots to completely trust Blackburn's engineers and some Geordie's ability to read a steam pressure dial. Miraculously, it worked, and very few people were ever killed in takeoff. Not none, though. Initially, they had no radar altimeters fitted to this aircraft, which was designed to fly very fast and very low, so the engineers simply did the sensible next thing, and they cut 2 panels out of the bottom of the pilot's seat and covered them in perspex so he could see obstacles like garden gnomes or tennis court nets. Later, the RAF pilots judged things by the number of legs that various animals had. At 500 feet, cows have legs. At 200 feet, sheep have legs. At 50 feet, dogs have legs. Any lower than that, and you weren't looking at the animals anymore. Easy. Once radar altimeters were fitted, they made things a little bit better, but they only worked in level flight, so if you banked a little bit, they'd show that you'd climbed several hundred feet because they only pointed straight down. Not content with such madness, the lads at Blackburn also chucked on a rotating bomb bay, meaning that weapons did not need to sit in the airstream where they could slow the aircraft down, or indeed get ripped off by waves. You might think I'm kidding, but almost all Royal Navy Bucc crews will talk at some point about losing something off a wing pylon due to the sea. Talking of pilot interviews, some of the things that they say about flying the Bucc are quite interesting, not least that it was very easy to see out of, and provided that you were under 6 foot, it had a pretty comfortable cabin. The engineering folks at Blackburn, they felt that 2 sets of instruments or dials was a bit wasteful, which meant that the pilot and the navigator each had a completely different set of dials and knobs with no replication, so they had to work very closely together. In fairness, the rear seat was slightly offset to the right so that the nav could see about half the pilot's instruments, particularly the blown border control stuff, and so provided that the right engine was the one of interest, and Nav could roughly see what was going on, even if he couldn't do anything about it but grab the ejection handles. Of course, as I mentioned a minute ago, initially the pilot's view of where he was going was enhanced by the little holes in the floor for the naval version. Once the RAF got hold of it, they rather felt that was a bit too disconcerting, so they had the panels welded up. Their ability to fly unbelievably low, in part thanks to this all-ground visibility, was legendary. When the Bucks first went to the famed Red Flag joint exercises with the US Armed Forces in the late 1970s, it's fair to say that very few US aircrew had ever heard of the Buccaneer. In subsequent years, F-5s, F-102s, F-106s, F-15s, F-16s and latterly F-18 pilots would all spend long, frustrating days trying to work out how to lock up on one, whilst the Buccaneers flew along at 100 feet or less at 580 knots and merrily blew their targets up. Aggressor squadron pilots often reported only being able to see them visually because the dust or the sea trails that were being thrown up, whilst their weapons systems stubbornly refused to engage. During Operation Hyperion and Operation Pulsator, when British forces were deployed to the Lebanon in 1983, low-flying Buccaneers from 208 Squadron caused havoc by going below rooftop level to warn off rebels from attacking British ground troops. Apparently, rebel commanders phoned the British headquarters to assure them that they weren't actually shooting at the British, they were shooting at the Americans, which was just fine with us. The Buccaneers could do some pretty impressive things. I'll give you for instance, it was capable of flying 12,000 pounds of bombs, 2,000 miles at 540 knots at 200 feet. That's about 670 miles an hour or so. So roughly a B-17's worth of bombs, damn near the speed of sound. Designed to cover long distances low down, it was an incredibly stable platform in a way that, say, the B-52 or B-1B just isn't today. And because when the advent of SAMs came along, it was already at that level, it meant that the service life of the Buccaneers continued a very long time. Indeed, when the RAF went to go and have a look at the F-111K as a low-level attack aircraft, they eventually realised that the marginal gains over the Bucc were so slim and the maintenance overheads so high, not to mention the cost of acquisition, they just went with the Buccaneer despite it having been originally developed for the Navy. It was a master of air-to-air refuelling, and actually there's a whole story about how air-to-air got developed, and Buccaneers are at the heart of it for the Royal Navy. This massively increased the range, and it allowed them to do things like, for example, in Belize in 1972, convince Guatemala that the British had a carrier very much closer than they did. Patrolling If you know your RAF aviation history, this is the point where I say the magic words TSR2, and the comment section lights up to the, oh, it was going to be awesome, they should have made it, and it was a tragedy it never got built. Well, okay, look, I have opinions on that, and one day we will discuss them. But for now, let's leave that alone and say that the TSR2 project was cancelled because it was massively over budget and behind schedule, so kind of fair enough. That left the RAF looking for a strike bomber, so they naturally turned to the Americans and examined the F-111 Aardvark. Having looked at its performance and the cost of buying it and the cost of maintaining it and what you got in exchange for that gargantuan pile of money, the RAF decided no. They were going to use the Buccaneer for about 1/10 the cost, and without all the exciting health problems and weird and wonderful chemicals that the US had shoved into the fluid systems for the Vark. In 1968, the RAF took delivery of 26 shiny new Bruff beasties, and then in 1979, when Ark Royal was scrapped, they got a whole bunch more from the Navy's Buccaneer force. Sadly, it was at about this point that another key feature of Blackburn's long aviation engineering traditions reared its ugly head, in that the wings started to fall off. Literally. First was the 12th of July 1979, where the wing fold joint failed, and then again in Nevada on the 7th of February 1980. Both accidents were fatal and pilot and crew killed. After a lot of investigation, it was found that the Bucc Mark II had extended wing tips, which were brilliant for making it more stable, but it put stress into the airframe at exactly the wrong places. Each airframe then had a limited life over 9.5 G. Strengthening work was done, the wingtips were removed, but the truth was, from then on, no one could be totally sure if it wouldn't happen again. So with the exception of operations like, for example, in the Gulf, Buccaneers were limited to less than 9G manoeuvres for the rest of their operational lives, which is another 14 years. The more I look at British aircraft manufacturing of the 1950s and 60s, the more I realise that whilst the Air Ministry and later the Ministry of Defence were frightfully keen that British flyers should have excellent aeroplanes, they were often a lot less focused on, the weapons to put on that airframe. There seems to have been a sort of make, do and mend kind of an attitude, sort of born out of the notion that provided a chap with some guns was somewhere close to the enemy, all would be well. All that changed over the Falklands when the supposedly slow and ill-equipped Sea Harriers made mincemeat out of the Argentinian Air Force using the latest US Sidewinders, outperforming not just the Argentinians, but also the ground-based Rapiers and the ship-based Sea Dart missiles, and suddenly everybody woke up to needing decent systems. So in the 60s and 70s, the Buccaneers were equipped with the US AGM-12 bullpup missile, which was, it was chod. It had a range of 12 miles, but only if you had visual on the target throughout, it being a fly-by-wire system, and it could only fly at Mach 2, which meant if you're doing nearly Mach 1 yourself, and hang on, let me do the maths on this, oh yes, that's twice as fast. Put it a different way, if I'm doing 0.95 Mach, that means I can fire the missile when I'm about 60 seconds from the target at the weapon's maximum range. It will take about 30 seconds for the weapon then to travel to the target. I have to fly straight and level for that full 30 seconds, keeping control of my missile whilst the bad guy responds, and B, I am now not 12 miles from the target, I'm 6 miles, and he's going to be quite upset with me if he isn't dead, which he probably won't be because the Navy didn't actually take the armour-piercing type of the bullpup, so what would probably happen is it would just bounce off the ship that I'm aiming at. Chances of survival, net zero. When the RAF took over, they started using the Martel anti-radiation missile, which was also, honestly, not great. It flew slower than the Buccaneer, although it did have a much longer range than the bullpup, so you could probably get away. Things changed quite radically with the advent of the Sea Eagle, which was a proper monster, and this is the basis of the platform that became the Storm Shadow, which I'm sure you've read about in Ukraine. The Bucc could carry 4 of these mothers, and they were capable of self-guiding to a target about 110 miles away, flying low and breathing air. These were very, very good weapons for their time, but sadly, they were solely a maritime weapon, and the proposed Golden Eagle, the land version, was never actually made. The upgrade to the Sea Eagle meant that they also needed a much better radar and navigation system, so they dropped the thing which had been called the Blue Jacket Doppler nav system, which was just pants, and replaced it with a very clever inertial guidance upgrade. And that meant that the weapon knew where it was. Buck navs were considered to be second to none because they pretty much had to be up until that point. A stopwatch, a notebook and a map was mostly what they had, even really up until 1990. Lastly, because sometimes your bomber needs to have a bit more fuck you, over the years, the Navy and then the RAF realised that they could fairly easily add an extra Sidewinder missile on the pylons, meaning that they deployed into the Gulf they were carrying the Lima 9s. Only one, mind, but a flight of 4 machines on the deck would cause an attacker to think twice, at least from the front. Talking of the Gulf War, the Bucc clearly spent most of its life not seeing any combat, and all that changed in 1991. Somewhat to the embarrassment of RAF High Command, they had largely missed out in the Falklands and were forced to resort to an airframe that was going to be retired, specifically the Vulcan bomber, to have any impact. So in 1990, they were completely confident that history wouldn't repeat itself. Only it was. When the Gulf War broke out, the RAF responded to Operation Granby by deploying its shiny new Tornadoes to fly ultra-low level and sprinkle Iraqi air bases with cluster bombs. Listening carefully to reports at the time, you can almost hear the Dam Busters theme tune running in the background. The reality was that no one in the RAF had ever actually fought any kind of a war, at least not like this. It was really a peacekeeping and deterrent force, not a war-fighting one. Someone who joined in 1970 could have done 20 years without firing a shot in anger, and what they knew about fighting, certainly against an enemy armed with anything more dangerous than a sharpened mango, could be written on the back of a postage stamp. There was a vast chasm between theory and practice, and it was exposed badly in the opening phase of the war. Attacking airfields was fantastically dangerous work, and within a matter of days, the GR-1s had lost 6 aircraft and 5 crew. Having got some fairly serious side-eye from the US Air Forces, the RAF High Command recognised that they had a real problem, and rather than doubling down, which would have been incredibly tempting, they rapidly moved to fix things. To their extreme credit, they called on the 208 Squadron to rush out their Bucks to the Gulf to help and support the struggling GR-1s. The Bucks had 2 jobs, first to find the target and light it up with a laser using a thing called Pave Spike, and then to make the Iraqi anti-air wish that they picked a different career by frying their sensitive radars using the Bucks' incredible electronic countermeasures pods. In the end, a total of 30 airframes wound up going to the Gulf, and all 30 came back, much to their credit. The Bucks, built for low-level attacks with crews trained to Pave Spike from about 100 feet, suddenly had to get into the habit of doing the same kind of thing, but this time from medium height and working with Tornadoes and indeed US air crews to do the job. And this was both good and bad. Good in that they had loads more time to illuminate the target, but bad because they had loads more time to be illuminated as the target. They got the hang of it in the end, but it wasn't straightforward, and there were a number of missed drops initially. According to papers that were declassified under the 30-year rule, so very recently indeed, about 750 attempted drops by the RAF, just about half of all bombs missed their targets. 191 of those misses was down to aircrew error. But with the addition of Pave Spike on the Bucks, things improved massively, and it really did rescue the reputation of the RAF. It improved, but it was not perfect, far from it. They still missed regularly. The lessons learnt in the Gulf were taken and then applied to the next generation of requirements for both Typhoon ground attack upgrades and for, indeed, the current F-35s. But it showed the limitations of a 30-year-old plane really built when computers were the size of a room, trying to fight a war which was rapidly heading towards a digital spectrum battle. By 1991, the Buck really was showing its age. There were cracks across spars, there were gear problems, there were rear fin issues, there were electrical problems, and a host of additional systems and upgrades over the years had created a complex nightmare of electric wiring. Although during the Gulf War conflict the airframe stood up to the test remarkably well, that was more down to good ground crew maintenance and procedure than a sign that all was well. Late-era Buck cockpits are a thing to behold, with dials and buttons and controls literally all over the place. It got a belated set of chaff and flare dispensers, it got an ECM pod, and it got various bits to carry the sidewinder, and so on and so on and so on, but it was all getting a little bit desperate. The RAF looked at upgrade options, but what it really needed was something that would be capable of doing long-range strike and close air support, which the Buck really wasn't capable of. It had never been built to do that job. And in point of fact, the GR-1 Tornado really couldn't do that job either, but it was there and it was good enough and it was more economical to upgrade. And so that became the stopgap before Eurofighter was ready, which will be ready any minute now. Any minute now. Yeah. And so the decision was then reached, unfortunately, to let the Buck go, and the final Buccaneer flew into Bruff for the first and the last time. Of the 211 Buccaneers built, 78 would suffer crashes of some kind during their service, which killed about 50 aircrew over a 35-year career. That sounds pretty bad, but when you consider that 30% of all Sea Vixens crashed in their 15 years of operations and killed 1 in 9 of their crews in the process, it's a definite step up. I mean, it's not great, but then flying off carriers is fucking dangerous, and 75% of those accidents did happen on carrier operations or in South Africa. It was super quick at low level, almost magically so, and the performance remains insane even today. The fabled TSR-2 that I mentioned earlier was not going to be able to perform as well as the Buccaneer at low level, nor come to that could the F-111F, which cruised at similar heights but nearly 100 knots slower. It was 1950s tech upgraded and fettled and invested in only the way that the British know how to remain viable long past its realistic end of life. The job it did to chuck nukes at enemy ships, is gone, the job it picked up and can be done far better by other platforms, and so things go. Blackburn is part of BAE Systems now, and in their near century of operations, the Buccaneer remains perhaps the only truly brilliant aircraft that they ever made. Still, better have had one good one than none at all. Eh, Fairy? Yes, Fairy, I'm looking at you, son, and I'm a-coming. So, that was the Blackburn Buccaneer, and I hope you enjoyed it. Other videos will be coming soon. I'm hoping to try and get a couple done this month. Meanwhile, if you have enjoyed this, do feel free to like and subscribe and all that jazz. I should point out that I have an email address if you'd like to send me a missive. It's lordhardthrasher@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter, occasionally, to upset the Vatniks. It's a slightly strange username. It's Lord Hardthrasher, because apparently Elon is too mean to allow proper names, and I couldn't keep the last R. To be frank, I do that mostly, as I say, to upset the Vatniks and to troll YouTube when they're mean to me about one of my videos, but if you want to watch an Englishman scream into the void, you can. Well, that's really it from me, so have a lovely day, evening, night, morning, whatever time of day it is with you, and I will see you all back here again very, very soon for something completely different.